The World Eater Prime was a jagged scar across the stars, a vessel 3 miles long that had tasted the crust of 1,000 planets. High Commander Vrex stood on the bridge, his scales shimmering with the cold hunger of his people. Before him lay the jewel of Sector 9, a planet of impossible blues and greens, radiating a level of peace that felt like a personal insult to a warrior race. "Scan completed," the AI chirped, its voice a metallic rasp. "Biological signatures detected, 2. 1 bipedal mammal, grade D. 1 quadrupedal canine, grade F. No planetary defense grid, no orbital platforms. The planet is undefended." Vrex let out a chittering laugh. "A waste of a world. Send a harvesting squad. Secure the mammal for the slave pits and prepare the core drills. We start at dawn." On the surface, Arthur was not looking at the sky. He was focused on his hydrangeas. The soil here was acidic, requiring a delicate balance of minerals that he had spent 3 years perfecting. Beside him, a golden retriever named Buster lay in the shade of an oak tree, his tail thumping rhythmically against the grass. The peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a shadow. A Vraxian dropship, a brutalist slab of black iron, descended through the clouds, its thrusters scorching the meadow a mile away. 4 warriors emerged, encased in power armor that hummed with the energy of captured suns. They moved with the practiced arrogance of conquerors, their heavy boots crushing the local flora. They found the human at the edge of his garden. He was wearing a faded, world's best grandpa apron and holding a pair of rusted shears. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He didn't even drop his shears. He simply looked at the massive reptilian soldier in front of him and sighed. "You're on the mulch," Arthur said, his voice raspy but calm. "I just put that down this morning." The lead warrior, a captain named Scar, raised his plasma rifle, the barrel glowing with a lethal violet light. "Mammal," he hissed, the translator on his chest struggling with the human's dialect. "You are now property of the hegemony. Kneel, and your death will be swift." Arthur looked at the rifle, then at the scorched grass behind the soldiers, and finally at Scar's primary optical sensor. There was no fear in his eyes. Instead, there was a deep, weary sense of disappointment. It was the look a teacher gives a student who has failed a test they didn't even study for. "I have a sign at the edge of the woods," Arthur said softly, gesturing toward the tree line. "It says private property. No soliciting, no trespassing." I spent a lot of money on that sign. It was meant to save us both a lot of trouble. Scar stepped forward, his heavy boot crushing a vibrant blue flower. "Your signs mean nothing to the Star Eaters. This world is ours." Arthur's grip tightened slightly on his shears. Buster, the dog, sat up. He didn't growl. He simply watched Scar with an intensity that made the warrior's internal sensors spike into the red zone. "I'm going to give you one chance," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming suddenly cold and precise. The voice of a man who had once commanded the death of stars. "Get back on your ship. Leave this sector and don't ever come back. I'm retired and I'm having a very nice Saturday. I would hate for it to get complicated." Scar laughed, a wet clicking sound. He turned to his men, mocking the tiny mammal's threat. But as he turned back to strike the human, he realized the man was no longer standing where he had been. Arthur was now 3 feet to the left, standing exactly where Scar's shadow fell. He hadn't made a sound. He was just there. "You're still on the mulch," Arthur whispered. Captain Scar did not like being confused. Confusion was a biological error, a weakness that the Vraxian Star Eaters had supposedly evolved past through centuries of cybernetic integration. He spun around, his plasma rifle sweeping the air where the human had been just a millisecond prior. His internal thermal sensors were screaming, unable to lock onto a signature that seemed to flicker like a ghost in the refresh rate of his visor. Arthur was standing 10 feet away now, calmly inspecting the blade of his gardening shears. He looked bored. He looked like a man who was calculating the most efficient way to dispose of a household pest without getting his apron dirty. Arthur remarked that Scar was likely the captain, judging by the extra spikes on his pauldrons, which the human suggested was compensation for a lack of tactical imagination. He added that he had seen the Vraxian fleet logs in the Galactic Archives and considered them mere scavengers who picked at the remains of civilizations too tired to say no. Scar roared, a sound like grinding tectonic plates, and squeezed the trigger. A bolt of superheated violet plasma tore through the air, aimed directly at the human's chest. The heat was enough to turn the surrounding oxygen into a searing vacuum. But Arthur wasn't there. He moved with a terrifying, fluid economy of motion, known in the old Terran Special Forces files as the Ghost Dance. He didn't run. He simply ceased to be in the space the plasma occupied. The bolt struck the oak tree behind the garden. The ancient wood groaned and splintered as it was incinerated, falling in a heap of blackened charcoal. Arthur stopped moving. He looked at the smoking remains of the tree, then back at Scar. The disappointment in his eyes had hardened into something else. Something that resembled the cold, dark pressure of a deep-sea trench. That tree had been 200 years old, and it had provided the exact amount of shade the hydrangeas needed. Arthur was now officially annoyed. On the bridge of the flagship World Eater Prime, High Commander Vrex watched the feed with growing unease. He ordered a secondary landing party, but the AI didn't respond because the systems were already being compromised. Back in the meadow, the 3 remaining Vraxian soldiers turned toward their dropship. They expected to see their vessel ready for extraction, but instead, they saw a masterpiece of mechanical disassembly. In the minutes since they had stepped into the garden, the black iron shuttle had been reduced to its base components. The engine housing was stacked neatly to the left. The hull plating was piled by thickness to the right, and even the thousands of microscrews were organized into small geometric piles on the grass. There was no sign of a struggle or explosions, just the surgical efficiency of someone who understood Vraxian technology better than the engineers who built it. Arthur raised the rusted shears, which now looked more dangerous than a planet-cracking missile. He announced that Stage 1 was over, and that they were moving to Stage 2. The eviction. Suddenly the ground beneath the soldiers began to hum. It wasn't an earthquake, but the sound of the planet itself, or something massive buried miles beneath the surface, waking up to the humans' command. High in orbit, the World Eater Prime shuddered as its internal gravity began to reverse. Scar looked at his men, then at the old man in the apron. For the first time, the Vraxian felt the urge to run, but the grass had grown over his boots in seconds, pinning him to the spot. Arthur told Buster to keep an eye on them while he put the kettle on, and the dog's fur began to ripple with a blue energy field. Buster wasn't a dog. He was a Class-15 Sentinel. High Commander Vrex gripped the edge of his command throne as the World Eater Prime groaned with the sound of 1,000 structural rivets straining at once. The internal gravity had begun a rhythmic, nauseating pulse, shifting from double weight to weightless every 4 seconds. On the bridge, Vraxian officers were being tossed like debris, their heavy combat boots clattering against the ceiling before slamming back into the floor. Vrex roared for the AI to stabilize the ship, but the only response he received was a soft, melodic whistling coming from every speaker on the deck. The sound of a human kettle reaching its boiling point. The primary view screen, which usually displayed the tactical layout of the star system, suddenly flickered. It didn't show the human fleet or planetary defense grid. It showed a high-definition, static-free image of Arthur's kitchen. The human was calmly pouring steaming water into a ceramic teapot, his world's best grandpa apron slightly dusted with mulch. He looked up at the camera, and for a terrifying second, Vrex felt as though the old man was looking directly into his primary soul stalk. Arthur took a sip from a blue mug and sighed, the sound echoing through the ship's billion-credit audio system with crystal clarity. Arthur informed the High Commander that he had spent the last 20 minutes performing a remote diagnostic on the flagship's core. He noted that the Vraxians were using a modified Proxima-class fusion reactor, but they had neglected the safety relay bypass, a mistake Arthur called amateurish. He explained that while he was waiting for his tea to steep, he had taken the liberty of remapping the ship's central nervous system. The Vraxian AI hadn't been destroyed. It had simply been convinced that its primary function was no longer to conquer worlds, but to assist with Arthur's domestic chores. Vrex's mandibles clicked in a frantic, desperate rage as he ordered his tactical officers to fire the planetary core drills. He wanted to crack the planet in half, just to silence the old man. However, when the weapons officer slammed the ignition trigger, the ship's massive drills didn't fire downward. Instead, they began to retract into the hull and started performing a series of rhythmic, complex movements. To Vrex's horror, the planet-cracking machinery was now being used to expertly till the soil in a 5-mile radius around Arthur's cabin, preparing the Earth for a new season of planting. "You don't understand," Arthur said, his voice dropping that pleasant, grandfatherly tone for something far sharper. "You think you're here to take a world, but you've actually just volunteered for a very intense internship in landscape architecture. My garden needs a lot of work, and your ship has exactly the kind of heavy-lifting equipment I've been looking for." He added that since they had incinerated his oak tree, The Vraxian flagship would now serve as his new automated greenhouse until he decided they had worked off their debt. The bridge lights turned a soft, warm amber, and the combat readiness sirens were replaced by the gentle chirping of Earth songbirds. Vrex realized with a jolt of pure terror that his crew no longer had control over the engines, the weapons, or even the life support. The World Eater Prime was being pulled toward the surface, not by a tractor beam, but by its own automated landing protocols, which Arthur had rewritten in the time it took to boil water. The massive ship was being forced to descend into the tiny meadow, its jagged, war-torn hull destined to become a very expensive garden ornament. As the ship entered the lower atmosphere, Arthur set his mug down and picked up a tablet. He looked at the sensor data and frowned, mentioning that he had detected a secondary Vraxian scout fleet hiding behind the system's fourth moon. He told Vrex that he was currently sending them a digital cease and desist order. Just as the flagship's landing struts extended, every screen on the bridge turned black, replaced by a single pulsing red countdown timer. Arthur whispered that if the scout fleet didn't jump to light speed in the next 60 seconds, he would be forced to escalate from annoyed to productive. The timer on the flagship's main screen ticked down its final seconds. High Commander Vrex watched in mounting horror as the secondary scout fleet, hidden behind the system's fourth moon, ignored the humans' digital warning. They were proud warriors of the Vraxian hegemony and refused to retreat from a single elderly mammal. Instead of jumping to light speed, the 30 warships began charging their plasma batteries. When the timer hit 0, Arthur took a small sip of his tea and pressed a single button on his tablet. He did not launch missiles or activate orbital lasers. He simply inverted the scout fleet's navigational systems and disabled their inertial dampeners. In an instant, the 30 warships instantly reversed their trajectory at maximum thrust, slamming backward into the lunar surface and creating a brilliant, completely silent flash of light against the starry sky. Vrex collapsed to his knees. His invincible flagship was now resting peacefully in a meadow of wildflowers, and his backup fleet had been erased with a gentle tap on a screen. The doors to the command bridge hissed open. Arthur walked in, still wearing his faded apron and holding his blue ceramic mug. Behind him padded Buster, the golden retriever whose eyes now glowed with a steady, intense cobalt radiation. Vrex's elite guards struggled to raise their heavy weapons, but the dog let out a low, vibrating growl. The sound frequency immediately drained the power cores of the Vraxian combat armor, permanently locking the suit's joints and pinning the soldiers to the floor under 1,000 pounds of dead weight. Arthur approached the central tactical table, casually swiped away the holographic map of Vrex's galactic conquests, and set down his rusted tablet. He looked at the High Commander with the icy, professional disappointment of an inspector evaluating a catastrophically built shed. He informed Vrex that the hegemony's invasion tactics were an absolute embarrassment. Arthur began to methodically list their failures, citing their reliance on predictable frontal assaults without prior reconnaissance, the use of outdated shield generators that could be bypassed by a standard kitchen timer, and, worst of all, the mindless trampling of freshly laid mulch. He pointed out that if the Vraxians had attacked an active Terran military installation, they would have been vaporized in 3 seconds. Because they had invaded his personal garden, however, they were about to face something far worse than death, which was human bureaucracy. Tapping the screen, Arthur projected a lengthy contract written in dense, ancient Terran legalese. He stated that as compensation for the ruined hydrangeas and the incinerated 200-year-old oak tree, the entire surviving crew of the World Eater Prime was officially drafted into mandatory community service as landscape architects for the next 2 centuries. Vrex shrieked that his warrior race would rather die than become agricultural slaves. In a final act of defiance, the High Commander slammed his claw against his wrist computer, attempting to trigger the flagship's catastrophic self-destruct sequence. Instead of a piercing alarm, soft jazz music began to pipe through the bridge's audio system. A polite, automated voice echoed from the speakers, informing Vrex that his request for self-destruction had been placed in a queue, and that the current estimated wait time for a representative was 47,000 years. Arthur finished the last of his tea, set the empty mug on the main navigation console, and leaned in close enough for Vrex to see his own terrified reflection in the human's glasses. The old man whispered that death was too easy of an escape, and they still had to weed the entire southern hill before sunset. Suddenly, the deep space scanners that Arthur had hijacked began to emit a piercing, rhythmic warning chime. The radar indicated that something impossibly massive was approaching from the deep void. It possessed an energy signature so ancient and destructive that it caused even Arthur to stop smiling. His expression hardened into a mask of pure, calculated stone as he slowly reached into his pocket for a heavily encrypted old-world military communicator. The ancient military communicator in Arthur's hand did not emit a standard transmission beep. Instead, it chimed with the gentle, anachronistic ring of a mid-20th century rotary telephone. High Commander Vrex, still kneeling beside the main navigation console of his grounded flagship, watched as the human brought the device to his ear. The massive energy signature approaching the planet was expanding on the tactical displays, swallowing the sensor grid with a mass that dwarfed the entire Vraxian armada. It was not a cosmic monster, but a Terran Coalition Worldcracker-class dreadnought, accompanied by a fleet of automated suppression spheres. Arthur spoke into the receiver with the casual exasperation of a man canceling a magazine subscription, explaining that there was no need for a sector-wide quarantine, and that he had simply experienced a minor landscaping dispute. A voice echoed through the bridge's comms, crisp and professional, belonging to Terran Admiral Elizabeth Morrison. She informed Arthur that his localized annoyance matrix had spiked into the red zone, triggering a Level 9 extinction protocol, and asked if she needed to glass the continent to neutralize the threat. Vrex felt his primary hearts stutter. The Vraxian hegemony had always believed that human space was heavily defended because the humans were terrified of what lurked in the dark. Now, staring at the telemetry of a fleet capable of unraveling a solar system's gravitational binding, he realized the Terrans did not build worldcrackers to keep the galaxy out. They built them to keep people like Arthur contained. Arthur politely declined the Admiral's offer, noting that he had already repurposed the invading force to aerate the soil and repair the 200-year-old oak tree they had thoughtlessly incinerated. Morrison sighed over the comms, a sound that carried the weight of someone who spent her entire life managing walking weapons of mass destruction. She agreed to stand down the primary weapons but insisted on maintaining orbital overwatch, warning Arthur that if the Vraxians caused his heart rate to elevate past resting levels again, she would turn their homeworld into a nature preserve. The communication line clicked dead. Arthur slipped the device back into his apron pocket and turned his attention back to the Vraxian command crew. The bridge was completely silent, save for the soft jazz that was still playing on the ship's audio system. The Star Eaters, a species that had conquered 1,000 worlds, were collectively holding their breath, waiting for the retired system eraser to issue his next command. Arthur picked up his tablet and projected a holographic schematic of the World Eater Prime's engine core. He pointed out that their dark matter containment field was leaking trace amounts of radiation, which was absolutely unacceptable for the health of his hydrangeas. He instructed the elite warrior caste to remove their armor, gather in the maintenance bay, and await further instructions from Buster, who would be acting as their foreman. Vrex attempted to protest, citing intergalactic prisoner of war treaties, but Arthur simply adjusted his glasses and offered a thin, chilling smile. He reminded the High Commander that the Vraxians had not declared war on the Terran Coalition. They had trespassed on private property. They were not prisoners of war, but uninvited guests subject to local homeowner association rules. And those rules dictated that the entire crew needed to start digging immediately. As the Vraxian warriors were herded toward the airlocks by the glowing Sentinel dog, Arthur glanced down at his rusted tablet to check the ship's internal temperature. He stopped, his pleasant demeanor vanishing in an instant. The dark matter radiation leak he had detected was not a byproduct of poor maintenance. It was a rhythmic, pulsing frequency. Vrex's attempt to trigger the self-destruct had failed, but it had successfully bypassed the ship's main computer to activate a deep space royal beacon. Arthur looked up at the sky just as the daylight began to dim, blotted out by the massive, jagged shadows of 10,000 Vraxian war dreadnoughts dropping out of hyperspace. The Emperor of the Star Eaters had arrived to reclaim his flagship, and he had brought the entire armada with him. The sky above the garden darkened as 10,000 Vraxian dreadnoughts blotted out the sun. The Emperor of the Star Eaters had arrived in a flagship the size of a small moon, casting a shadow that swallowed the entire continent. A booming, static-laced voice echoed from every comlink and speaker on the planet's surface. The Emperor demanded the immediate release of High Commander Vrex, the return of the grounded vessel, and the unconditional surrender of the single human who had dared to defy his empire. His voice trembled with a terrifying rage, promising to reduce the entire planet to radioactive ash if his terms were not met within exactly 1 minute. Arthur did not even look up at the sky. He stood in the middle of his ruined flower bed, wiping his hands on his apron while staring with profound disappointment at his trampled seedlings. Vrex, who was still kneeling in the dirt with a shovel, let out a wet, gurgling laugh, entirely convinced that the human's arrogance was finally about to be punished. Instead of panicking, Arthur simply sighed, adjusted his glasses, and pressed a button on his outdated military communicator, opening a direct, unencrypted channel right into the Emperor's throne room. He offered a polite greeting and explained that there had been a terrible misunderstanding regarding the galactic maps. The human calmly informed the Emperor that the Vraxians had assumed Sector 9 was quarantined by the Galactic Council to protect the rest of the universe from humanity. Arthur gently corrected this assumption, stating that the sector was actually sealed off to protect the galaxy from what humanity kept as pets. Suddenly, the ground beneath the Vraxian soldiers began to tremble violently. But the seismic activity was not caused by gravitational engines. It was a deep, organic rumble that resonated from the very crust of the planet. Arthur explained that when humanity had decided to become a peaceful, diplomatic species, they needed a quiet place to hide their retired projects, which consisted of genetically engineered apex predators designed for wars the galaxy could not even comprehend. At that exact moment, Buster, the golden retriever whose eyes were now burning with a blinding cobalt light, let out a single deafening bark. The sound acted as a planetary trigger. In the distance, the waters of the calm ocean erupted as colossal, biomechanical Leviathans broke the surface, their massive spiked ridges piercing the cloud cover. In orbit, the sensors of the Vraxian Armada went completely haywire as the ship computers frantically signaled the mass awakening of Class-15 biological entities across every landmass and ocean on the planet. Arthur informed the Emperor that his fleet had just parked directly over the galaxy's largest kennel for ancient war monsters, and that feeding time had officially started 3 minutes ago. The human added that the Emperor had exactly 30 seconds to turn his ships around before Arthur let the dogs off their leashes. Vrex watched in absolute horror as the mountain range surrounding the valley began to shift and rise, revealing giant, glowing eyes that locked directly onto the Armada hovering in the sky. Realizing the catastrophic scale of his mistake, the Emperor panicked and ordered his fleet to fire their main planetary cracker cannons, deciding to shatter the world in one strike. But before the plasma batteries could even finish charging, the nearest oceanic Leviathan opened its massive jaws and unleashed a concentrated beam of pure antimatter. The silent, blinding beam sliced through 3 Vraxian cruisers simultaneously, cutting their heavily armored hulls in half as if they were made of wet paper. Arthur looked down at his watch, shook his head heavily, and quietly muttered to himself that he really had just wanted to spend his weekend in peace. The command deck of the Emperor's flagship was a monument to galactic domination, adorned with the gilded skulls of conquered species and bathed in the crimson light of tactical displays. That intimidating atmosphere evaporated the moment Arthur materialized directly in the center of the room. He did not use a dropship or a heavily armored boarding pod. He simply bypassed the flagship's impregnable quantum shields, using a pocket-sized transmat beacon, appearing on the royal carpet with a soft electronic chime. He was still wearing his faded apron, his boots were covered in fresh soil, and he carried a weathered clipboard. The Emperor's elite royal guard, a phalanx of towering warriors equipped with singularity halberds, froze in absolute shock. Before any of them could react, the flagship violently lurched as one of the planetary Leviathans wrapped its massive biomechanical tendrils around the vessel's outer hull, crushing the secondary thrusters like aluminum cans. Arthur tapped his pen against the clipboard, completely ignoring the weapons pointed at his head. He looked up at the Emperor, a massive, cybernetically enhanced warlord who suddenly looked very small upon his obsidian throne. Arthur informed the Emperor that the transmat beacon he had just used was obsolete Terran technology from 3 centuries ago, pointing out that if a retired gardener could breach the royal flagship with antique hardware, the hegemony's cybersecurity was functionally non-existent. He began walking up the steps toward the throne, methodically grading the Emperor's tactical deployment. He noted that packing 10,000 dreadnoughts into a single atmospheric layer restricted their evasive maneuvers, effectively turning the Armada into a stationary buffet for the Class-15 entities waiting below. The Emperor managed to find his voice, a booming roar that cracked with underlying panic, demanding to know how a single human could command such apocalyptic beasts. Arthur stopped, adjusted his glasses, and explained that humanity did not command the Leviathans. They had simply entered into a mutually beneficial roommate agreement. The entities kept the sector clear of unwanted pests, and in exchange, humanity occasionally provided them with a 10,000-ship armada to chew on. The human raised his clipboard and stated that he was issuing a formal eviction notice to the entire Vraxian hegemony. He handed the clipboard to the trembling Emperor, revealing a meticulously itemized bill. It included charges for unauthorized parking in a restricted orbital zone, the cost of repairing his trampled hydrangeas, and a substantial consulting fee for the impromptu military assessment he had just provided. The Emperor stared at the itemized bill, his cybernetic enhancements whirring in distress as he tried to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. He realized that the human was not negotiating. He was presenting the only alternative to total species extinction. Outside the massive viewing ports, the Vraxian armada was completely paralyzed. The Leviathans had surrounded the fleet, their glowing maws acting as localized gravity wells that prevented any ship from engaging its hyperdrive. Arthur checked his watch and casually mentioned that the biological entities had very fast metabolisms. He advised the Emperor to sign the paperwork and authorize the immediate transfer of the reparations, warning that the local wildlife was losing its patience and he had forgotten to bring their treats. As the Emperor reluctantly reached for the pen, a sudden, blinding flash of light illuminated the bridge. The flagship's central artificial intelligence shrieked a warning that the dark matter core of the ship was overloading, not from an attack, but from a containment failure triggered by the Leviathan's crushing grip on the hull. The core meltdown was irreversible, and the explosion would be powerful enough to wipe out the entire fleet and shatter the planet below. Arthur looked at the flashing red alarms, let out a deep, tired sigh, and muttered that if you wanted a job done right without destroying a solar system, you simply had to do the maintenance yourself. The red emergency lights of the flagship bathed the command bridge in a sinister glow as the dark matter containment field began to fracture. The Emperor of the Star Eaters sat frozen on his obsidian throne, his cybernetic enhancements sparking as they failed to process the mathematical certainty of their impending vaporization. Arthur did not panic. He simply clipped his pen to his clipboard, walked past the petrified royal guards, and approached the main engineering console. He pulled a specialized heavy-duty hydrospanner from his apron pocket, a tool that looked absurdly primitive but was forged from collapsed star metal. With the practiced, weary efficiency of a retired maintenance worker fixing a stubborn radiator, Arthur bypassed the Vraxian encryption, ripped the console's faceplate off with his bare hands, and began manually realigning the containment magnetic coils. Sparks rained down on his shoulders, singeing the fabric of his apron, but the human did not even flinch. He casually mentioned over his shoulder that the Vraxians relied too heavily on automated safety protocols, completely forgetting the value of analog hard stops. With a final violent twist of the hydrospanner, the deafening shriek of the overloading core abruptly spun down into a low, stable hum. The blinding red emergency lights reverted to standard illumination. Arthur wiped a smear of black grease from his forehead, walked back to the Emperor, and gently tapped the clipboard against the warlord's chest armor. He politely reiterated that the consulting fee for saving the fleet from total atomic annihilation had just been added to the final bill, and that the total was due immediately. The Emperor did not argue. With trembling claws, he signed the digital eviction notice and authorized the immediate transfer of 300 trillion galactic credits to a secure Terran trust fund. Arthur reviewed the signature, nodded in satisfaction, and pocketed the device. He informed the Emperor that the Armada had exactly 5 minutes to break orbit before the Leviathans decided the fleet was a permanent addition to their diet. He also suggested that the Vraxians should immediately update their star maps to ensure they never accidentally wandered into the Terran retirement community again. With a soft chime, Arthur activated his transmat beacon and vanished from the bridge, leaving the most feared warlord in the galaxy hyperventilating in his own throne room. Down in the garden, Arthur materialized just as the massive Vraxian flagship engaged its emergency thrusters, tearing through the atmosphere in a desperate, undignified retreat. The 10,000 dreadnoughts in orbit scattered like frightened insects, breaking every known formation protocol just to escape the gravity well of Sector 9. The colossal Leviathans watched them go, letting out low, rumbling vocalizations of disappointment before slowly sinking back into the depths of the ocean and the crust of the earth. The sky cleared, the sun broke through the clouds, and the gentle chirping of earth songbirds returned to the valley. Arthur walked back to his porch, picked up his blue ceramic mug, and took a sip of his tea. It was a little cold, but perfectly acceptable. Buster trotted up the steps, the glowing cobalt radiation fading from his eyes as he returned to looking like an ordinary, happy golden retriever. Arthur patted the dog's head, looking out over the trampled flower beds and the scorched earth. It would take a few weeks to fix the landscaping, but he found that he did not mind the work. Far above, the galactic communication networks were already exploding with the news of the hegemony's humiliating defeat. Updating the universal hazard databases with a single, terrifying new rule regarding humanity. The galaxy had finally learned that the most dangerous humans were not the ones actively fighting wars, but the ones who had finished fighting them and simply wanted to be left alone.